Good morning. Did everybody have a good evening last night? Raise your hands if you didn't, and I'm going to come see you, and I'll help figure that out for tonight. Okay. So welcome to day 2 of the Sallows Fry Conference on this beautiful day and beautiful Treaty 6 territory and the home of the Métis Nation. I want to, everything I heard from yesterday is that there were incredibly full, rich discussions, and I want to thank everybody who participated, both presenting, asking questions, and otherwise engaging in the material. And the discussions I heard both in sessions as well as in the hallways and over lunch and throughout the time was wonderful. And thank you for all of you for making it that way. And thank you for the excellent presentations. I think I sat in on at least a tiny bit of most of them, but I wish I could have sat in on all of them. And so we will be making available the ones that have been live streamed and videotaped. We haven't been able to do that. It's a cost thing. We thought it was more important to get as many people here and to have them accommodated than it was to necessarily create records. But if you have PowerPoints, you have papers, and you're comfortable with them being distributed, do send them to either me or Lori, probably better to Lori, because she'll keep track of them better than I will at this right today. And also I want to thank all of you who have the lived experience about which we are speaking often. There are so many women here, and there have been some men as well. And it's always wonderful to have that engagement. And as I'm always reminded by one of the first women lifers I had the privilege of working with, we don't just listen to your stories. That would be just as disrespectful as if we didn't listen to your stories. We critically engage and analyze and work with you to develop your analysis. And that's part of what makes this one of the most enriching experiences for all of us. And I want to thank you for that. And thank you for our academic and activist colleagues who've also participated in that process. We will, at the end of the day, have a reception. Looked like there was some confusion. It was merely that Vince's session is actually the last session in the last session of the day. It's not competing with the reception. So at the end of the session, everybody will gather in the hall in front of the segregation cell. That'll be where we have our reception. And we'll be basically celebrating all of the wonderful learning that we've had from today and yesterday. Before we start today, though, I want to recognize and acknowledge someone who I consider one of my primary mentors and a leader in this area. Someone who lived in this community and taught in this university, and who left us for the spirit world November 17th, 2010. She's part of why I'm here at this university. She was actually scheming, and those of you know Trish, that was a particular word of hers. She was scheming about how she would get me here. She had decided that first she would get Mary Eberts here, and she did that, and Mary Eberts was in the Sallows chair a few years ago. And her plan was for me to come and transfer my PhD from Australia to University of Saskatchewan and do it under her. And we were having that debate, and she would have won, probably, if she hadn't decided to go somewhere else. But it was a significant part of what influenced me, along with Glenn and others here, who really were strong encouragers for me to come here. But it really was Trish who laid the groundwork in my mind and in my heart for what has been one of the, a very rewarding and wonderful year, and it soon will be 18 months. And as part of that, Trish, those of you who know her, and her dear friend and adopted sister, Patty Tate, is here as well. Her son, Michael, is here. She was a mother, a daughter, an aunt, a sister, a friend, an activist, an ally, an agitator extraordinaire, and an incredible advocate. Because if she were here, she would have been a central part. If she was in the physical world here, I'm sure she's here. I felt her at times. I think she was the one flinging those books out of my hand yesterday, just reminding me. Because she was the one who, when I first went to her and said, things are really going off the rails with the Okimauchi Healing Lodge. And I said, but they're calling me racist for trying to name it. And she says, "What? You've never been called," excuse my language, and bleep it on the thing, "a fucking name before?" And I thought, okay, that put it in perspective. So those of you who know Trish know that she inspired us to be the best we could be and think and analyze and demand the best of ourselves and everybody else we worked with. And she was an incredible support for many, many, many of you here, I know, and certainly for me. And she will continue to be in terms of her legacy through her writing. And when I moved here, one of the things that was really wonderful about moving here was that I would get to spend a bit of time with her boys, who I have known since they were young. And Mike I've known since he was a baby. Mike and my Mike were played together as children. Trish and I were in Ottawa at the same time when I arrived in January of 1992. And one of the things we did routinely was scandalize the Ottawa academic and activist community by bringing the two Mikes, who proceeded to usually hold the floor on any discussion that was happening. And all of the meetings ended up being in a circle around those two boys, who would be variously entertaining and interrupting us, as they should be. And so I asked Mike to come this morning because when we were having a conversation some time ago, and you'll remember, you've got a sharper young mind than me, Mike, exactly when it was, but I realized that Mike had none of Trish's books. Didn't even know that she had published 3 books, because her primary focus with her family was her family. And yet most of us know that she had an incredible academic and activist career, and that she has contributed much to this area. So I asked him to come, and I wanted to give him a couple of things. My copies of the books that your mom gave me, 3. One of them arrived after she had died, because it was in going to print, and a dream catcher that she gave me that she told me to hang over my kids' beds, and the award that you were at the event when she received the Human Rights Award, and the video's been playing on the outside of the segregation cell. You may want to go remind yourself of that wonderful day when she received the award. And as you know, when she left us for the spirit world, she left this for me, and said that it would help me through some of the times that would be tough, and it has indeed. And now I want it to pass it on to you to help you through the times that have undoubtedly been tough, but you'll continue to rise to the occasion, and you'll continue to be the leader that she knew and loved you for being. So thank you very much, Mike, for coming. Okay. Now it is my profound pleasure and privilege to introduce another friend of Trish's. And in fact, I think it was Trish who probably introduced us first, Shireen Razak, who is a scholar, activist, friend, incredible mentor as well. All of my students here know you because they read you, not just in the classes that I offered, but that many other professors here offer. And your bio is available. And as I said yesterday, I'm prone to, just say, yes, all the titled and untitled who are here, welcome. And I think that I don't want to waste any more time except to have people hear your voice and your incredible presentation. So, Shireen, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to
Thank you very much, Kim, for inviting me here. Kim did send me an email this morning saying that she was going to give the books to Mike. And Mike, you won't remember me, but I too have known you since you were a baby. And it is emotional. I actually, I accepted Kim's invitation to come here. I wanted this to be the first place that my new book would be available. And I owe a lot in this book to Tricia, not only for the usual things of teaching me how to understand and analyze things, but she actually took me by the hand and drove me to meet with people to do some of the research. And so a lot of it, especially the parts that pertain to Saskatchewan, I really owe to Trish, and it's really special to me that Mike is here and that you've acknowledged her. Still emotional. So Saskatchewan is where this book started. I only have one copy, but you all have flyers with the order form if you want to buy it. But so this is the book. It's called Dying from Improvement. And Saskatchewan was really where it all started in the late 90s when Pamela George was killed. Some of you, do you remember Pamela George, some of you? And I wrote about that principally to show that Pamela George was never, ever considered a human being in her trial, in the trial of her murderers. And at that time, when I came to Saskatchewan to talk about that, people would come up to me and say what to my ears were very devastating things. They would say, one of my sisters, two of my sisters, three of my sisters died this way. Now, if you're an academic from Toronto, that is not a world that you are even close to. And I remember feeling at the time completely unable to deal with this violence intellectually. I remember feeling scared and thinking, I don't know what to do with it. So eventually I did write about it, and then I began to think about sort of other kinds of deaths that were happening really routinely. So routinely that it was amazing that no one was actually noticing. And that led to a study of Indigenous deaths in custody. And I chose Saskatchewan and British Columbia. And Saskatchewan, I mean, maybe if I had chosen Manitoba, it would seem like that was the epicenter of it all. But I chose Saskatchewan, and if you see in the book, there's a chart of 100 deaths that I was able to research for Saskatchewan for a 14-year period, which translates to about 7 deaths a year, which I think is actually less than what actually happens. But we have no way of tracking this. There's no easy way to identify when someone has died in custody if they're Indigenous. There's no easy way to even identify what is a death in custody and what isn't. And so that, I think, really helps the state as well. So some of this research was an attempt to kind of understand what was happening. On the cover of the book, there is the gravestone that marks the place of Paul Alphonse, who was a Secwepemc man from Williams Lake Sugarcane Reserve. And it was his death that sparked some of my research. A friend of mine was actually one of the Indigenous lawyers on the case. And after the inquest was over, I was able to order the transcript and read about what had happened during the inquest. And I discovered something that would remain sort of the final conclusion of this research. Paul Alphonse's family located him in hospital, in police custody, a few days before he died. They'd been looking for him everywhere, and they couldn't find him. They found him in hospital, and when his niece found him there, she noticed that there was a large purple boot print on his chest. Alphonse died shortly after his family found him, and there was an inquest, and here I am reading the inquest, reading the transcript. And I was surprised to find that the boot print was actually a kind of side issue, a very peripheral issue. Instead, sort of the pages and pages of the transcript was taken up with discussing Alphonse's alcoholism and the difficulties that he posed for police and healthcare professionals. The focus on his alcoholism effectively canceled or deflected attention away from police-Indigenous relations in Williams Lake. In fact, what it did was preempt the boot print, so that we never got any real discussion of that, never got to go anywhere. And this was not for lack of trying to bring that issue to the table. Counsel for the band, for the family, the chief of Sugarcane Reserve, Indigenous professionals, all tried desperately to bring the matter of these violent relations to the table. And it just disappeared. And that began my research for this book, because I wanted to track how the story of alcoholism and dysfunction ended up displacing any kind of interrogation of what I would call colonial or racial violence. In effect, even in those inquests or inquiries that are relatively progressive, even in those, and that's the minority, where there are actually legal representatives for families, which so seldom happens, even in those inquests, state accountability faded away the more that details were brought in about physically and emotionally ravaged Indigenous people. This unvarying pattern, you see it in every single inquest, really prompted the question that I had, which is, why is Indigenous death in custody, but also elsewhere, always considered a timely death, a death that no one could prevent and no one caused? Just happens. So my argument is a very simple one in the book, which is, when you read inquests and inquiries, what you see is the story of the Indian on the brink of death. And this is a very long-standing white settler story about the vanishing Indian. Inquests and inquiries fill our heads with details about fatty livers, mental illness, alcoholic belligerence, sometimes even a mysterious incapacity that Indigenous people have to survive. We don't know why. They fill our heads with these things, and they end up telling the story of a people that are simply disappearing, leaving in place a superior, more advanced race. In effect, they tell a very racial and colonial story. And that's my book cover. In effect, if you look at the dictionary definition of disappearance, you will see that all three stories are there in an inquest, but only one is acknowledged. So the inquest tells the story of the vanishing Indian, people who have somehow ceased to exist, we have no idea why, people who have vanished or passed out of sight. What it doesn't tell is the third one, to cause someone to disappear, especially by kidnapping or murder. If you think about it, we're actually all very familiar with this story. You don't have to reach far down in your consciousness to know this story. The idea of a vanishing race. In fact, we're familiar with it in pictures. If you see this one, Indians riding off into the sunset. This is a part of the pictures of Edward Curtis, who's this famous photographer, and it's really interesting if you go online to look up these photographs, which are very beautiful, many of them. There's a kind of disclaimer or a warning on the website that this collection, and I'm going to read it, reflects a perspective that Indians were primitive people whose traditional cultures and ways of life were disappearing. So they warn you that that's what Curtis is actually telling that story. The narrative of the disappearing or dying race is the oldest settler colonial story, and it can be found, and this is why I think it's important, it can be found everywhere in the law. For example, when he rejected the land claims of the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en of northwestern British Columbia, Mr. Justice McEachern commented on the relentless energy of Europeans with which Indigenous people would not or could not compete. He concluded that if Indigenous people were conquered, it was not by force, but simply because the superior capacities of a more resilient group triumphed. So basically, we won because we're better. These kinds of narratives are actually common in settler societies from Israel to Canada to Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And as one Australian scholar, Dirk Moses, has suggested, it actually plays a very important role, because if you tell the story of the vanishing Indian, then this hides, in his words, it masks choices that were actually open to policymakers, choices that they were not prepared to entertain, because they fundamentally approved of the civilizing process in which they were engaged. So when inquests and inquiries tell the story of the disappearing Indian, colonial states provide themselves with alibis for inaction, but also alibis for crimes of overt violence. The other thing about the disappearing race idea is that it is very important and productive for settlers, because through it, settlers can begin to feel their own superiority. So perpetually needing assistance from an enlightened and superior race, Aboriginal people or Indigenous people are scripted as remnants, while settlers become pioneers. As Lorenzo Veracini writes, the definition of a successful settler project is when Indigenous populations have been reduced to a manageable remnant. The road to settler success is actually lined with legal decisions that declare what settlers hope is true, that they have become the original citizens through their own enterprising spirit. What I wanted to do in this book was really track this story as it winds its way through the law. So my interest in the book is the official story. What is the official story that a white settler society tells about Indigenous deaths in custody? What do inquests and inquiries conclude about a man who dies in a hospital in police custody with a large visible purple boot print on his chest, a mark that no one in the hospital or the police notice? How do we account for the police dropping off a barely conscious alcoholic older man, Frank Paul, Mi'kmaq, in a dark alley on a cold Vancouver night, a man who could be seen on a video recording being dragged into the police station because he was unable to walk? What sense are we to make of these patterns of deaths that involve a repeated failure to care, a systemic indifference and callousness and cruelty, and sometimes outright murder? What is the story that you see? In examining inquests in Saskatchewan and British Columbia, there are in effect two storylines that you can trace. The first one is kind of like tracing a shadow, because it's not the story that is really openly acknowledged, but it begins to peep through with the details. And that's the story of the power, I call it again, colonial power, that is actually imprinted on Indigenous bodies, just as a boot would stamp a body and leave a print. This is the story of what is done to the indigenous body to make it disappear, to make the colonial line about a superior race and inferior race true on the ground. Sometimes it's a boot print. Sometimes it's a literal eviction, as you well know, if from Saskatchewan, from the city into the freezing cold, freezing death. Sometimes it's a shooting, but also sometimes it's a letting die. It's allowing things to happen that lets the body die on its own and makes it seem natural. The second story is the legal performance of Indigenous people as a dying race. So inquests perform this story with endless testimonies about these livers, these addictions, these pathologies. Now, many people who hear this argument will immediately point out that inquests and inquiries are very peculiar, particular kinds of legal sites. An inquest is a legal process conducted by a coroner, and its purpose is to determine cause of death. It's not a criminal trial. The aim of an inquest is to identify what would prevent death from happening. An inquiry shares this kind of investigative rather than adversarial function. So coroners and commissioners are always telling people these processes are not trials. They're not concerned with establishing innocence or guilt. Instead, they're devoted to the prevention of deaths. But if inquests and inquiries are structured to have very little time for what actually happened, how do they get through the process of who did it to the end point of how to stop it from happening? The inquest or the inquiry is actually tailor-made to present both the story of the disappearance of a race, because we can see all the facts, we can see the liver functions, and the story of white settlers assisting Aboriginal people. The inquest or the inquiry is devoted to the most quintessential of colonial activities, which is improvement. We know they're dying, we have no idea why, let's try to prevent it. That benevolent story of aid, of improvement. Critical scholars, and I'm not the first scholar, many critical scholars have noticed that states defend their reputations and the actions of police and medical professionals in inquests. Inquests really turn, as two scholars have said, on speaking ill of the dead. That's the whole dynamic that's going on, is trying to show that it's their fault that they died. Those who are most vulnerable to police violence are transformed into individuals who are blamed for their own deaths. Are Indigenous deaths in custody any different than other deaths where the dead are blamed? In this book, I argue that while we can trace the same processes in virtually all inquests where individuals are thought to have caused their own deaths, in the case of Indigenous people, it is really important to think about what is secured when this story keeps getting told again and again and again. And I think we need to focus on what is secured. What is secured is the colonial project. Indigenous people stand in the way of settler colonialism. They refuse to go away, contesting settler legitimacy, contesting the fact that the settler is not legitimate, that the land is occupied and it continues to be stolen. So perhaps more than any other group, the millions of the impoverished, the criminalized, the psychiatrized, the teenagers like Ashley Smith, Indigenous people really challenge the settlers' claim to modernity. And the challenge is very material. You have only to think of the current resource extraction issues today. How are you going to keep getting your hands on all those resources? You can't do it unless you tell the story of a dying race. So It is, of course, true that the bodies that inquests and inquiries examine with such care, sometimes they read like an issue, a CSI thing, those bodies are often bodies that are on the edge of death, bodies weakened by ill health, addiction, and disease. But what the law establishes is that there is no duty to care, either because it would be hard to know how to care for such bodies at this stage of decay, or because care is pointless. Who can stop the march of history? Ultimately, the claim that I make is that the dehumanization that is so central to the colonial project is a systematized one. It is very necessary. It is what structures the prison. It is what structures the criminal justice system. And it is what structures the legal processes that appear to give the rule of law, the benefit of the rule of law. Let me stop for a minute and just comment on the numbers of deaths in custody. Saskatchewan really was the place that first brought this to sort of national and international attention because of freezing deaths. So in 2001, when Amnesty International named incidents of freezing deaths and indicted Canada, the world began to pay a little more attention to Indigenous deaths in custody. But from then on, it really hasn't gotten much better. It is really difficult to actually track this, as I have said. For Saskatchewan, the approximately 100 inquests that occurred between 1996 and 2010, only 39 can be confirmed as Aboriginal, but there is a long list of 33 who are more than likely to be Aboriginal. But it's a guessing game that you have to do. You have to read death notices in the newspaper to see if anyone's getting a feast. Then you know that it's Indigenous. Well, what kind of, I can imagine all my critics saying, what kind of authoritative research is this? But I can say, I think, with relative certainty that 2/3 of these deaths are Indigenous in Saskatchewan. What kinds of deaths are they? Well, we know the most iconic, the freezing deaths, but there are other deaths that really allow us to glimpse what I think everyone in this room knows very well, which is the continuum of violence in Indigenous lives. So, for example, in 1999, a 19-year-old man is found hanging in his cell. His aunt noted at the inquest that he had begun to drift away from his family and culture after attending residential school. Another young man is described as periodically suicidal, diagnosed with a form of schizophrenia. He killed himself in a facility described as having staff shortages. In each of these really short 2 or 3 line descriptions, which is all you ever get, you see the state peeping through. Shortages, what is that all about? A 28-year-old mother of 5 took her life while in solitary confinement in 2000. The acting warden commented to the press that the young woman fit the profile of inmates who are transferred to the prison, this particular prison, because they are deemed too hard to manage. A study released 1 week earlier confirmed that solitary confinement is particularly hard for Aboriginal women. How many studies do we have to have that reveal this? I could go through all of these deaths, and had I the time, I would have taken you through how inquests discuss these deaths in order to show that it is really what you confront when you go through this is you can practically go through it with a red pen and check off those casual moments of inhumanity. You call an ambulance for a dying woman, the ambulance is 100 feet away and it takes half an hour to get there, and the person dies. How many inquests conclude, yes, we should check on ill prisoners? For 150 years, they have had the same conclusions. We should check. We should see if people are dying. We should respond to their calls for help. In all of these things, what you're tracing is this very systematized inhumanity And there are times when you trace this as a scholar where it is everywhere on the page, and it is so everywhere and so natural that it's actually hard to track who did what to whom, because everyone is behaving in this inhuman way. Death is always regarded as the end of a process, not the end of a life. And it is that process that you see when cells are not checked, when guards say things like, there's no point calling a doctor, people die, when calls for help are not responded to. We don't easily see the violence of neglect. I don't want to end this without talking about something that I wish I had time to develop more, which is there are many inquests where Indigenous families try their very best to name the violence that is there. And if I could give you just a quick example of an inmate who killed himself. He was a prisoner on remand from the far north. He appears to have planned his suicide carefully. The usual story begins to unfold in the inquest. Mandatory checks were not done to check and see if the prisoner was actually there, or they were improperly done. But the family, who did not have a legal representative, began to put on record questions at the inquest. So, for example, family members asked really pointed questions about how did the system deal with prisoners on remand. Such people were likely to be very emotionally shocked. What was done to deal with their emotional states? What was done for prisoners with very little education, who speak very little English, who are isolated and emotionally distressed? When one family member asked, was there any professional help available? The response was, elders are sometimes made available. This family member pointed out the obvious. Elders cannot offer professional psychiatric help, so where was the help? Were there other suicides in the prison? One family member asked. When the answer was, I think so, there may have been 2, she replied, I'm just amazed that you can't recollect prior suicide attempts. I mean, something like that would strike me as being of a really serious nature. How come it didn't strike you? I think those are moments in an inquest when the really obvious questions are asked. How does it happen, another family member asked, that there was so little professionalism among prison personnel? She phoned the prison and staff would tell her that she had reached Fort Moros and not the prison itself. As a teacher herself who had abided by a professional code of ethics, this family member wanted to know, why was there such systematic unprofessional conduct? The capacity to ask these questions in an inquest or an inquiry are limited. But what it is important to know when you track Indigenous people asking these questions is that these are the obvious questions that do not get asked, that do not disturb the story of a dying race. The inquest transforms the colonial condition into a medical one, legitimizing the violence that's performed at the police station, on the streets, and in the hospitals. My question at the end of this book is, instead of dissecting bodies and talking about fatty livers and talking about the effects of alcohol on people's bodies, it's not that we don't ever have to talk about that. What would it mean to dissect indifference instead of bodies? So why don't we put the focus on how guards or healthcare personnel or others treat Indigenous people? Could we dissect that in total CSI fashion? I'm all up for that. We should begin to dissect who are these people. I remember when the mother of Lawrence Wagner, one of the men who died in freezing death in Saskatchewan, she asked a very important question. Who would do such a thing? And I think that that is the question that we have to insist is asked everywhere. And we ourselves have to come to understand who would do such a thing. So that focus is not, I know it's very important to have the stories of people who have endured the violence, but we should use those stories to understand the people who inflict the violence. What is it that sustains them? What is it that produces them? The answer to who would do such a thing is especially important for educators, a group in which I place myself. Today, when universities and schools turn their attention to Indigenous peoples, it's nearly always with cultural difference in mind. It's not with colonial violence in mind. So non-Indigenous people are always being invited to please be culturally sensitive and notice Indigenous cultures, which is a good thing, but it's not a good thing if you think that that's where your responsibility ends. We have spectacularly failed to interrogate colonial violence. We have spectacularly failed to consider issues of Indigenous sovereignty and violence. And it is this that I really want to leave you with. Contemporary Canada is a place where it is possible for Brian Sinclair, an Indigenous man in a wheelchair, to wait 36 hours in an emergency room of the city of Winnipeg and finally to die in the waiting room. It is also a place where the inquest into Sinclair's death refuses to examine systemic racism. Those two things we have to really keep in mind. And then and only then, when we remember that this is a systematized brutality and cruelty, then and only then will we uncover the fantasy of settler civility, and we can refuse the game of improvement. Thank you.
And I brought these in here, so I'm going to start them going around so people can. I highly recommend this new book, even though I haven't read it yet, because I know it's going to be great. I highly recommend. I highly recommend all our other books too. So, it's now my pleasure also to introduce Coralie Smith. Probably requires no introduction to many of you. I first spoke to Coralie actually from this community. I had just spent 5 days, count them 5, trying to get in to see Ashley Smith after a number of women had advised me that I should see that young girl. That I should see that young girl who was hurting herself. And I was advised that I could not see her. She did not want to see me. I was given all kinds of reasons. I then went and got 2 real lawyers, and those of you who know the women once dubbed me a recovering lawyer, but I went and got 2 lawyers who practice here in town, Kathy Knox and Helen Samagamus, to come with me. They still denied us access, and on the 5th day, they allowed some women to come and see us in the visiting area. After that, though, one of the things the women told me was that that Ashley often spoke to her mom. And I did something that I have never done before, but I have done since, was I then researched and found out how to get hold of Coralie, called her, and I'm sure she remembers who is this weirdo calling out of the blue, because when I finally did, one of the things I did was not reveal too much about Ashley, just said that I was really wanting to meet with her. Others had said I should speak to her, and that I understood that she spoke to her regularly, and if she could just let her know that I would like to speak with her. And so that was our first meeting, our first conversation. Sadly, our next conversation was when I called her because Ashley had died. And I had a fair idea that what she might hear would be very different from what I might presume had happened based on my limited knowledge and my limited access and conversations with Ashley in that intervening 7 months. So that's how we first met. And there's a link also, Mike, just so you know, as you know, to your mom, because when when we managed to get exposed, why I wasn't allowed to see Ashley, I will go to my deathbed believing, was because it was after she had been assaulted. Allegedly assaulted, I'll say for those, the legal folks amongst us, because the man who, one of two who I believe assaulted Ashley while she was at the Regional Psychiatric Center, only one was charged. But when that man was charged and the trial happened, virtually nobody came forward. The one person who did was discredited roundly. And one of the things that I did was put her in touch with Trish and her family. And Trish, as so many of you have experienced, welcomed Coralie into her home and into her life, and they became fast friends. And so one of the things that we did for about a year was really strategize about how nothing we could do could bring Ashley back. But we wanted to try and do the best we could to ensure this never happened to another family. I'd like to say we succeeded, but we're now awaiting the time to do an inquest into yet another Indigenous death in custody, that of Canoe James, a woman who died here at the Regional Psychiatric Center after trying to call for help. It was deemed natural causes initially. I suspect once we finally have the inquest, and they may be, hopefully they won't delay it more now that they know I'm staying, but we had hoped that it would have happened while I was here this year, but now that I'll be here till December, the presumption is we'll at least get it done before then. So without any further ado, I know, Coralie, you had some reaction to Shireen's presentation, and I'd like you to just head off there,
yes,
and then we have
definitely. She mentioned the tortures and the horrendous way that we in Canada are treating our prisoners, and I'll call them prisoners for lack of inmates. There is no such thing as an outmate, so how can we have an inmate? So they're prisoners. One of the biggest thing on my mind is the segregation part. You can be segregated indefinitely. There's no set rule. There's no, at Ashley's inquest, there were recommendations that come out, speaking to that. However, nothing is changing. It's horrendous that you can put an 18-year-old young woman in a federal penitentiary and keep her in a cell 23 out of 24 hours a day. Now let's consider what you do when you're out for that hour. You want to have a shampoo, you want to have a shower, and you're going to get a little bit of exercise? Maybe. No one speaks to you. You're fed through the slot in the door. And if someone does, if a medical professional happens to come to speak to you, they're only speaking to you through the slot of the door. There's no one-on-one communication. Imagine what that's doing to any one of us that were put in that position. I know that, I'm just mind-boggled to imagine what would take place up here when you're in there by yourself. Nothing except if you're on good behavior, you can call your mom. Another amazing thing about being in prison, period, is the fact that prisoners don't tell their loved ones what's really taking place. When Ashley would call me out, how are you? Oh, I'm good, Mom. What did you have for supper? Oh, it would be a sandwich and an apple. And that's good, Mom. Ashley lost 90 pounds in 11 months. Horrible. Ashley and others, not just Ashley, I won't keep saying Ashley, in a cell with nothing except a suicide gown. And when I say nothing, it means no toothbrush, toothpaste, no blanket, no pillow, we're torturing our own citizens. We don't have to look at Guantanamo Bay and say how horrible that was, because the comparisons are so alike that you can't draw a line between the two. We're doing that here today. Atrocious for anybody. And medical care. You don't really get medical care. It's again through the slot in the door. In Ashley's case, she was on watch 24 hours a day. But the watch was just set outside the door. And this person outside the door couldn't hear her gasping for breath. Nobody, right through the inquest, through the whole thing, no one took responsibility like they're all hiding under a blanket, everybody. No one took responsibility for that order. Don't go in if she's breathing. Nobody. It was never written anywhere. It's just passed on, and nobody would admit where that came from. Ashley's not the only one that's like, she's not unique. She would not be unique. That's happening everywhere. They have power, and they also do not stand up and be counted. Our country is allowing this to take place. Any one of us could end up in a situation where we might have to end up in prison for what have you. So beware of what what your challenges will be. Can you imagine days on end, nobody speaking to you? Except to say, you know, come to the door or get here or get there? Horrible. The inquest procedure, what you come out of that with is no accountability again. No one is ever charged for doing a wrongful thing, an illegal thing, you know, against law. You really don't get any answers. You get a lot of recommendations. Well, you can give me 102 recommendations. It's sort of like having a shoe sale. And when you come to my shop, you say, oh no, those are all sold out. We don't have those $30 shoes, but I have these $50 ones. Same thing. Make all the recommendations you want, and if you're not even going to carry through one, really ask the question, why bother? Why do we go through that? You think you're going to go there and get answers, which very fortunately, the outcome of Ashley's was what we'd hoped for. Certainly not what we had expected, because the media allowed itself to repeat and repeat and repeat that Ashley had committed suicide. Not so. It was a homicide. They failed to go in and provide the necessities of life. And again, I say, Ashley's not the only one. With the difficulty here is that you can't tell an Indigenous person from anyone else. Why is that so secretive? Why wouldn't that be more above board? And why would they be telling the family in the first instance, oh, we can't tell you what happened, we can't discuss that? That's happened in a case in Nova Scotia, I think, Parks. Yeah, Veronica Parks. And of course, the people went to the newspaper, the family, because they didn't know that's what happens. They didn't know that when you call, you're distraught, you want to know, oh my God, what happened, what happened? Can't discuss that.
Well, they can, but they don't.
They don't. They don't. So when you go in prison and you have to buy your own body bag in case you die, it's $85, by the way. That comes out of your canteen money. And when they send you home, you come home in an old wooden box. There's no compassion for the prisoner, the prisoner's friends and families. There's no compassion. This is atrocious in Canada. This is atrocious. Before all of this took place in our lives, we had no idea. I thought you went to jail. We didn't even say prison, where I'm from. I'm a Maritimer, so we make everything short. Penitentiary is too hard to say, so we just say jail. We had the impression you go there and you can, well, I'm not going to joke about it. I was joking this morning, but we had the impression, oh, they eat steak and they got all these vegetables and lovely fruit and, you know, they go out in the cafeteria and everything's lovely. Not so. When you're on finger foods for a year, that's only something you can pick up with your fingers. You're not getting meat and potatoes or what have you. You're not getting the necessities to provide your own toiletry. You're getting 4 little squares, if they decide, of toilet tissue. What does a woman do at the time of the month that she needs more than 4? It's quite disgusting. So, I really can't understand why so much money is spent on an inquest after we've gone through it, and again, it's always all the terrible things they can drag up about the inmate. There was never one positive thing said, except when I spoke. Not one positive thing. Like, she had good days, she had this, she had that. She had a good sense of humor. She liked to write, she liked to draw. Well, because they wouldn't have known, because they took everything away from her. In Ashley's cell on the wall, what was left when she was gone is happy face. Happy face in yellow. She scratched on there probably with a crayon. So think about what we're doing, and think about what our politicians are doing, or lack thereof. And most of this horrible stuff that is taking place, most of us in the general population aren't even aware of the horrors. It is horrible. Yes. Are you going to read your little poem?
Oh, do you want me to get the poem?
Well, you jump right up there.
Your
Get with it. Yes. Ashley liked to write, and she liked to draw, and she was, you know, regular teenagers for when she was home. Ashley still had her doll collection. She had 40 China dolls, and she had her baby dolls. So I sent her last baby doll with her. Don't laugh. She was a 19-year-old woman, you know, in years, but she wasn't a 19-year-old woman. She took her baby doll. Piss pot is what I called her. She had them all named, but I said, I'll send Piss pot with you. One of those dolls that you can feed and give it water and stuff, and they have to have their own diapers. Well, she spent her babysitting money buying food and diapers and stuff for Piss pot. I found this in, I don't have all of Ashley's possessions because our lawyers requested them, and I never requested it back. I have a couple of her little diaries, and she just told me this a few minutes ago that she has used this poem before, but I recopied it and brought it today, just so you get a little taste of what kind of person Ashley was. It's not about death and dying. This one isn't. This is, life is full of beauty. Notice it. Notice the bumblebee, the small child, and the smiling faces. Smell the rain and feel the wind. Live your life to the fullest potential and fight for your dreams. Ashley's diary. That, in a nutshell, is what Ashley was. Ashley was compassionate, caring, kind. I could go on. But you never heard that in the media. Nobody ever, you know. And again, I say, because Ashley wrote this, I read it. But how many hundreds of other people, you know, they're known for 2 minutes of their life, and that's how they're treated. They're not treated as individual human beings. And like you said, the colonialism, the way that we have treated our Indigenous people is, it's more than breathtaking. It again is, it's terrible. It's horrible. So that's it, unless anybody wanted to ask me anything. No, of course not. Thank you.
Well, before we open it up to questions from you, there's a couple of things that I'd like to add and then ask for both Coralie and Shireen to comment on. One of I loved the title, and I don't take any credit. It's certainly Shireen's title, "The Dying from Improvement." And as soon as I heard it, I thought that is exactly the theme that we were trying to get at when Trish and Mary Eberts wrote up a piece for CAFES, for the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and Native Women's Association of Canada, on the hyper-responsibilization of women, particularly Indigenous women. And what we're trying to get at was the fact that as we've seen the retreat of the state in terms of, or the never ever there of the state, in terms of supports and services and protections, particularly for Indigenous women and women who've experienced violence and those with mental health issues. We've seen that the retreat of the state or the lack of availability of the state, but the minute they do anything for which they could be criminalized, we see the full weight of the state come down on top of them. So the hyper-responsibilization for them to both protect themselves, but then when they do act, they're deputized to protect themselves, the full weight of the state to criminalize them and punish them for that act of protection. And there are so many examples of reform efforts that have tried to address this in the area of women in prison, the Task Force on Federally Sentenced Women, the Arbor Commission, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the Correctional Investigator has made recommendations, the Auditor General, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and most recently, the recommendations from the inquest into Ashley's death. And now we're seeing court cases, and I was reminded of this when Bobby Lee presented yesterday, that even when there are what look like successful challenges, whether it's Bobby Lee's challenge or the Inquests case of the challenge to the mother-child program, or now the current challenges to segregation, one of the things that doesn't get challenged is the fundamental notion of who and what we criminalized. And that is one of the flaws, I think, of many of the approaches that have been taken and that are taken. And I think it's helpful, and I appreciate your exploration, Shireen. I know Deb Parks has done some. I know through the media, people like Betty Ann Adams is here, and Maureen Brosnan, who will present in the next session, have also done this. We try to expose those injustices, but we fall short when it comes to holding accountable those and when I say those, I don't mean individual persons, although there are times when we don't do that, but we also don't hold accountable ourselves or the state for the systemic ways in which we encourage the continued hyper-responsibilization of those and the avoidance of responsibility by the state for what happens to people. And I'm interested in, for both of you to comment on, what you see that you think we could do to rethink this area. I'm concerned with us doing the triaging and tinkering. I'm concerned when we finally mount a case and the lawyers want to take the easiest case forward, then it gets settled, then there's a silence, and then the presumption is, and this is what happened in Bobby Lee's case, for instance, on paper, the management protocol is gone, but those who were experiencing it are still experiencing the same issues just by another name, and now it's harder to challenge it because they've learned from that challenge how to appropriate the language, use it, and now we're seeing the same thing with the segregation challenges. Corrections is already reformulating structures, and the challenge doesn't fundamentally start with we shouldn't separate people. It starts with we shouldn't separate certain people in certain circumstances, and we should have strictures instead of starting from the much more fundamental place. So that kind of libertarian ideal versus more substantive equality, I think, is some of the challenge that lawyers face. And I'm just curious in terms of, what else you've thought of that we could be doing that doesn't just make the system look more palatable and more difficult to expose and challenge those inequities, but what else we could be doing to actually breathe life into it. And I know we have some ideas. We've been doing the Human Rights Manual and some things like that, but I'm interested in what else you see that we could be doing.
I always fear this moment when people ask, how are you going to fix it? Well, and my friend Verna St. Dennis told me that she would ask me the question, so do you want to sort of abolish inquests and inquiries? Do I think there should not be an inquiry into missing and murdered women? So, these are the moments that are very hard as a scholar. But I think, Kim, that you gave a partial answer, which is that depending on where you are in the system, you might want different things. So if you're a lawyer trying to sort of get some bit of justice for the family, you are obliged to play in the system, and maybe what I would say is it helps to go in knowing what you're up against, that what you're up against is not one or two bad people. You might not even find any really bad, evil people. that what you're up against is this very, very systematized inhumanity. So I would say, I would never be confident to say, let's not have the law, let's not have the inquest, let's not have the inquiry, because, as I think Robert Williams said, you always want the right to have a seat on the bus if you're the one denied the seat on the bus. So, you're going to need the law. And actually, in times of crisis, I think we need more law rather than less law. So you need to sort of regulate things. But having said that, I think I'm with, any number of people who have concluded that you really do have to start with an abolitionist viewpoint. You have to start with that. Let's get rid of prisons. Let's start with no one should ever be in solitary confinement, ever. The trouble with starting with such categoric positions is that no one listens to you. Right after you get that sentence out of your mouth, they sort of shut down with, well, what do you mean? How are we supposed to? So I think that that's where our strategies kind of have to be, but we should be clear among ourselves that we believe that no one should ever be in prison. No one should ever be in solitary confinement, that is what we believe. And from that, we need to sort of map out sort of what are the things that will get you there, over time. And they sometimes are contradictory things, because you might have to end up sort of negotiating rules around solitary confinement when you think there should never be any. But, around solitary confinement, there is quite a growing movement that actually says that should never happen, ever. So I think, we have room to build on that.
We had a commissioner, council, he was called. In England, they have councils for everything, housing councils, and this was the prison counselor, like he was a general all-over council. And in England, they use 5 days segregation. That's recommendation that came out of Ashley's inquest. 5 consecutive days is the absolute most. You have to come out. I think only 106 days a year, so that would be 5 at 5-day intervals. And you had to be out a certain length of time. Well, the way our system stands, as I said previously, you can go there and for whatever reason, you may not get out for years. One thing they do is upon transfer, if you're in segregation and they're going to transfer you from point A to point B, that segregation status is broken while you're on the plane or whatever till you get to your new place. And then because your status here was segregated, they segregate you again.
That's against the law.
Yeah, it is against the law, but this is what happens. The time, and this is what happened to Ashley. She was moved 17 times. The only time she got out of segregation was on a move. What I think about segregation, maybe we can't abolish it altogether. It would be wonderful if we could. But it would be wonderful if we got these people before they were in such a state, especially our younger people. Ashley was a kid. You take all these children that are in youth centers, why are they getting transferred to the federal system and being automatically put in segregation? Because your status follows you. Your status follows you. And when you're in there, like I said, you don't have daily face-to-face meetings with the mental health professionals. It, again, is through the slot. That's what I'm thinking on segregation. I really, like I said, I think in some cases, maybe it's a necessity, but you have to have rules, and it has to be nationwide. It can't be your rules here and your rules there and my rules here.
So just to be clear, the law is that it shouldn't happen the way that it did for Ashley and that it happens for so many others. And I'll answer my own question perhaps.
You have a better answer.
Yeah, no, I don't have a better answer. But I get asked it all the time. Whenever I'm testifying, the very first question is, well, you don't really believe in prisons anyway, Ms. Payton. Aren't you an advocate for that? And I love getting that question because the reason I love it is because I always start with the statement that I was a working class kid who started doing this work, and when I first started walking into prisons, I honestly believed, because I've been raised to believe it, that if you do the crime, you do the time, and I was even taught capital punishment was okay. After now 32 years of going in and out of prisons, I see no benefit. No social benefit, no economic benefit, no legal benefit. And I see increasingly people, to pick up on your point, both of your points, is there are people inside the system increasingly of that view. Part of the reason we never say, let's go after the individual officer or decision maker is because it is a systemic problem, and increasingly people working in the system are recognizing that, and we get just as much information from people working in the system as we do from those who are imprisoned by it. That's one thing. But the other piece is every community that I've been in this country and in other parts of the world, where you ask people, if you ask them a simple question, you'll get a simple response. If someone does the crime, should they go to jail? Yes or no. You know, some will say no. But if you peel back even one layer and say, if it was your mother, your brother, your sister, your auntie, or even in your community, there are 5 people who have been sent to prison, and this is what it's for. Do you think that's the best way to prevent that from happening again or to assist that individual? I have yet to find a community where the first answer is incarceration. Even when it starts, when I've been asked to go to a group that identifies themselves as victim advocates. Now that's telling something. It means there's a big lie that it's what we all want. It means that we have normed crime and criminalization in this country in a way, and in other parts of the world, but certainly in this country, in a way that limits our vision and limits our ability to imagine a different world and a different way of being. And I think it's not just utopian. If you give me every person that you could put before me, every man, every youth, every woman that I've met, I can identify, Ashley wasn't identified as having mental health issues when she was actually in prison and alive. It wasn't until the inquest process she was identified as someone predominantly with mental health issues. Ashley was someone who was dehumanized from the moment she walked into a prison setting, not by every individual who dealt with her, but by a systemic approach. And so I think that we can do that, and we do see that done. We see it done through individuals in our organization, individuals in other organizations, people who meet with, who are families and friends and allies and activists working in and around the prison system, and we have to challenge that. So it's not just saying, let everybody go free. It is fundamentally about talking about different ways of imagining being responsible and accountable in a society where you care about people, first and foremost. And I see Mike has a question. So I don't know if everybody heard Mike's question. How do we promote it? I think we do it one person at a time, 2 people at a time, and we vote with our, so this is a nonpartisan statement, and not because I work currently for a nonprofit as well as for the University of Saskatchewan, but the reality is no party, no political party in this country has taken a progressive position on criminal justice issues, not one. And I would say none have taken it on social justice issues either. And so we need to do it at every level, on the personal level, on the political level, in terms of how we deal with people. I often will say how you treat everybody around you is indicative of also the philosophy you have in general. So whether it's the work you're doing in prisons, whether it's your work as a lawyer, whether it's your work as a parent, whether it's your work as whatever you're doing, that if you don't see first and foremost the person in front of you, then you will not be able to see the humanity. So I think it's a process that is and requires that kind of human and social and financial investment too.
Do you think that restraint should be more like using these sorts of restraints? So you think there should be more of a protocol that would, like, in your view, what is the thing that would stop from using restraints on women? Like, do you know what I'm tell you? Like, what can you do about the restraint issue?
So are you talking about the fact that women are restrained often?
Yeah, like, get strapped to,
Yeah.
chair. Like,
So-
is there a law or rules around
Yeah, there are laws and rules around that. It's basically not supposed to happen again, and it's often used. It's actually going to be one of the discussions in the session that, well, you and Yvonne and Sheila Wildman will be talking about, which is, you know, how do you actually deal with some of those sorts of issues? And the reality is, we often talk about the crisis moment, and that's what happened in the inquest. It happens in many of the inquests, in the ways that Shireen talked about and Coralia talked about. They end up talking about the individual in the moment when the crisis was happening, and in a way that also de-responsibilizes, takes the responsibility away from the state and responsibilizes the individual. And they end up talking about none of the ways that all of that could have been prevented much earlier. And so our view, and it's what I said at the inquest as well, is that we could do many things much earlier to prevent these things from happening. That's right.
I mean, I'm assuming if you eat fries, you guys might get say like no.
Yeah.
It's inappropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments you guys want to make? I just realized anything else you like? No. Any other, one more question, and then we'll let you go for the break. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Welcome to Saskatoon, Sherry. I have been reading your stuff for so long, and you got me through law school in ways you'll never appreciate. Thank you for that. Coralie, thank you for being here and being brave enough to tell us your stories. I really wanted what you do.
Well, I'm sorry I never wrote any books yet. Everybody's written this and written, I'm thinking, oh, all I write is letters.
And darn good ones at that. So.
I want to challenge you about not looking at the institutional players. My current work is around looking at lawyers in the profession and the mental health issues that lawyers have, and the huge rates of depression, and the fact that suicide is the third leading cause of death among lawyers. Those are the gatekeepers. EMT, military people, police, and corrections officers, they are the ones that are suffering from the highest rates of depression, suicide, family violence. They're the ones that are gatekeeping this. What if we have an inquest? What if we have an inquiry? What if we turn the camera around and we study the lives of the people who are looking after the prisoners? Because I think there's no system without people running it.
Right.
And there's good guys and bad guys everywhere. And some days I'm a good guy and some days I'm a bad guy. And I think we really have to think about the fact we keep looking into every detail of the lives of the people we're studying, and not about the question that you said the family member asked. Who can do this to somebody else? There's studies that show if you shut down emotionally to deal with the subject matter in your life, you shut down everything.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just shut down at work in the moment that this woman is having a crisis. You shut down everywhere. And I think once we start looking at the gatekeepers, we're going to see where the problems are really coming.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I? Yeah, you go ahead. Go ahead. I'm glad you asked that, Marilyn, because if it sounded like I was saying no accountability, I'm not saying that at all. Because I know that was what I said, that not going after the individuals. And the reason I said don't go after the individuals is from a bunch of reasons. I was raised in the military. Not me. I'm a service brat. And watching the paramilitary organizations of policing and watching the self-regulating bodies my experience is, and talking to those of you who are much more learned than me, is that anywhere that you see the focus on punishment, and I'd say even in education and child rearing, you see the focus on punishment, all the resources become about avoiding responsibility. And that's what I see in terms of what Shireen was talking about as well, and what Coralie was talking about. And again, it may sound, and certainly even when Louise Arbour talked about it, people, she put in a little punishment part in her recommendations, but one of the things she talked about was that corrections, particularly for women because the numbers were smaller, could be the flagship. And what about if you promoted people because no one was put in SAG? What about if you promoted wardens and they got promoted not because they protected the butt of the minister, but because they actually got more people out of prison faster. What about, so we could change it around in different ways that would hold people accountable, but in a really positive way, and inspire them to act in the way. And I think the same would be true in the legal profession. I think the same could be true in other areas as well. And certainly the area where I was first working on this was when on civilian oversight of law enforcement was talking about that if you actually promoted police officers who did work in the community and never charged someone, and the crime rate, there wasn't an increase in terms of risk to the community, that think of the difference in how you would encourage. And so I think there are ways that we could envision it. And I like personally Louise Arbour's recommendation that where that doesn't happen, and you have correctional authorities, so all you prospective lawyers, and I tell all the law students, you've already heard this, but it bears repeating, where you see an individual experiencing a sentence in a way that the judge never intended. So you all know the basic rule, prison law 101. When you're sentenced to prison, that's the punishment. Anything that takes away your liberty anymore is either not allowed or there's rules about it. And if there's rules about it, you're entitled to know what they are. And if those rules are not obeyed, then why shouldn't you be able to go back to court and have that prison sentence revisited? So all you lawyers, I know Dan's already going to do it, but those are the sorts of challenges that I think will help hold individual players responsible in a way that doesn't just inspire them to hide it more, which is what we see happening in the prisons all the time and in policing. They just hide it more. They find the language to excuse it easier or better, and that's what they're doing right now already with the segregation challenges.
I would just add to that, I'm very reluctant to view police and military and other sort of gatekeepers as substantially different than the general population, because I actually think they're exactly the same, and most studies support me, that they reveal and have the same responses as the general population. The problem with that, though, is that the general population does devalue Indigenous bodies, right? So it's not as though a cultural sensitivity training or better training will actually get rid of the problem, because it is much deeper and more generalized than that. And I guess, when I hear Mike's questions, I know that when people hear me say that, they actually think, so what? We better not do anything because there's no way to do anything about it. But I think at the same time as we have Kim's and Louise Arbour's suggestion, which I think is a good one, what if the system rewarded humanizing rather than dehumanizing? I think that's a good strategy. But at the same time, we have to understand that the responses that we see from the justice system or from its various players is a response that we see in the general population at multiple sites. And rather than discourage us, that should just convince us that we are in the midst of a project of rule. And it's going to need to be tackled and challenged at multiple sites. What is an Indigenous body worth? How do we know about that worth throughout society? So I think that while we think of the prison as an institution that could be reformed, or the justice system that could be reformed, we need to not disconnect it from wider processes out there that sustain it and keep it going. It's really important not to do that, because all the strategies that they're so fond of in inquests and inquiries have to do with this assumption that we could just get individuals to change a little and all will be well. And that is the assumption I think we should not make.